Okay, so you would have already had this lesson by now, so I'll just quickly go over the main points that we discussed. So we're up to rounding decimals, which basically means getting rid of a certain number of decimals, or maybe even all of the decimals, to make the number a little bit more manageable, to make it easier to understand. Now, let's assume that this number here, we want to round it to 2 decimal places. So all we want when we rewrite this number, we just want only 2 decimal places. So these ones here, the 9 and the 6. Okay, so I'll just put this over here to remind us. So this is basically just saying we want to round this whole number to 2 decimal places. Okay, so how do we do that? So basically, if you look at the steps here, you'll see that step 1 is saying for us to circle the first decimal that you don't need. So what are the decimals we don't need? Well, we need the first 2, so the decimals we don't need are the rest of them. So let's put those as red to make it clear. Okay, so these are the decimals we don't need. Now, it's saying circle the first decimal you don't need. So these are the decimals we don't need. The first of these decimals we don't need is the number 5. So let's circle the number 5. Okay, so step 1 is done. Now, step 2, it's asking us to ask the question, is the first decimal you don't need, is it 5 or greater than 5? Well, in this case, if you look at this number here, the first decimal we don't need is the number 5. Okay, so far we go to the next step, which says if 5 or greater, add 1 to the last decimal you do need and remove all decimals you don't need. So what we have to do is add 1 to the last decimal you do need. So the last decimal we do need is the number 6, because this is the second decimal. We want to round this number to 2 decimals, 1, 2. So the second one is the last decimal we do need. So it's saying here for us to add 1 to the last decimal you do need. So now we need to add 1 to this number 6 here. And then it's saying remove all decimals you don't need. So we need to add 1 to the last decimal we do need and then get rid of the rest that we don't need. So let's go ahead and do that. So we rewrite this number as 18.97. So that's basically it. So again, just to summarize, if the first decimal we don't need is 5 or greater than 5, we add 1 to the last decimal we do need. And that's basically it. Okay, so what happens if the first decimal that we don't need is less than 5? What do we do? So let's look at the same number, and let's say that, for example, we want to round this number here to 3 decimal places. So let's do that. So if we follow the steps, it's pretty easy. All it's saying is, again, for us to circle the first decimal you don't need. So we want to round this number to 3 decimal places. So that means we need the first 3 decimals, and we don't need the last decimals there. We don't need those ones. So basically, it's saying for us to circle the first decimal you don't need. The first decimal we don't need here is the number 4. So we circle the number 4. And it's saying, ask, is it 5 or greater. Now the first decimal we don't need is the number 4, so it's less than 5. So what do? Well, as the steps say here, step 3, if less than 5, just remove decimals you don't need. So we don't need to add 1 to anything. All we need to do is remove the decimals we don't need. So we can rewrite this number as follows: 18.965. And we leave it at that. We don't include these last ones here we don't need. So if the first decimal we don't need is less than 5, then we just remove those decimals, all those decimals we don't need, and leave the decimals we do need, and that's it. Okay, so let's try one more. Let's say that the question is asking for us to round this number you see here to 4 decimal places. Okay, so again, we just follow the steps. It says circle the first decimal you don't need. Now, if we have to round to 4 decimal places, then we need the first 4 decimals, but we don't need the rest of them. So the first of the decimals we don't need is the number 7. So we circle the number 7. Now the next step is to ask, is it 5 or greater? So is the first decimal we don't need 5 or greater? In this case, the first decimal we don't need is 7, which means it's greater than 5, So now we have to, as the steps say, if 5 or greater, add 1 to the last decimal you do need. Okay, so the last decimal we do need is the number 9. So we need to add 1 to the number 9. So let's do that. So 1 plus 9 is 10. So that means that we have to rewrite this number as 27.4630, because 1 plus 29 in this case is 30. So the 9 will change to a 0, and the 1 before that, the 2, will change to a 3. So we're just adding 1 to this last digit here. So your final answer should be 27.4630. And we include the 0 here because it's saying 4 decimal places. So we need to include that 0 because that's the 4th decimal place. Okay, so your homework for what we've just covered is on page 216 of your textbook. I want you to do all of question 1, question 2, question 3, question 4, and question 5.